Now, since 2007, or since the early 2010s, really, there hasn't really been a major security issue that both sides have equally championed with the same degree of passion and enthusiasm.
Hello and welcome to The Focus. I'm your host, John Bruni. Today we're talking about one of the most important and yet most overlooked relationships in Australia's foreign policy, our ties with Indonesia. Consider this. Americans instinctively understand the importance of Mexico to their economy, security, and politics. But here in Australia, we often know more about faraway powers like China, Japan, or even the United States than we do about Indonesia, our vast neighbour of 270 million people just across the Timor Sea. That gap in public awareness matters because Indonesia isn't just a neighbour. It's the largest Muslim majority democracy in the world, a G20 economy, and a country that sits at the heart of the Indo-Pacific's emerging power balance. Historically, our relationship has swung between cooperation and crisis, from the days of confrontasi in the 1960s to the trauma of East Timor in 1999, to more recent joint operations against terrorism and people smuggling. Indonesia has been both a test and a partner for Australian diplomacy and defence. Yet despite the high stakes, people-to-people ties remain thin. Language learning is in decline, mutual perceptions are often shallow, and political differences over issues like West Papua occasionally flare up. So why does this matter for Indo-Pacific security? Australia and Indonesia sit on one of the busiest maritime highways in the world, a front line in the contest over rules, influence, and resources. Suppose these two countries cannot find common ground on cyber threats, maritime security, or disinformation campaigns. In that case, the stability of the broader Indo-Pacific is at risk. To explore these challenges and the opportunities, we'll be speaking with Dr. Gatra Priyandita, co-author of a major new report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute on the Australia-Indonesia Defence and Security Partnership. Gatra, welcome to The Focus.
Hello from Canberra. Thanks so much for having me, John.
Okay, so Gatra, you and your co-author Ewan Graham warn of optimism bias on Australia's side of the equation. Can you give real examples where Canberra's expectations of Indonesia have exceeded Jakarta's willingness or interest to engage?
So I think generally the expectation in Canberra is that given Indonesia's size, its history of international activism, its role as sort of primus inter pares, or first amongst equals in Southeast Asia, Indonesia would play a more proactive role in international affairs, in particular, sort of responding to maritime adventurism from China, to violations of international law in the South China Sea and elsewhere, and more broadly just in regional security. Now, it's true that Indonesia has responded to a lot of these issues in its own ways. I mean, it has, for example, taken a strong legal stance, using the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to respond to China's incursions in the South China Sea. But it has not responded in a way that I think Australia would hope it would. Again, so the expectation is that Indonesia does a lot more for the region in terms of regional stability and security, given its size. The preference, I think, in Indonesia right now is to still maintain a relatively cooperative relationship with all major powers. And there are multiple different reasons behind this. I think central amongst which is just this a lack of elite consensus in Jakarta about the nature of the China threat. Unlike in Australia, where I think Chinese behavior in the South China Sea and elsewhere has been seen as a cause for regional instability, the perspectives in Indonesia is that US-China competition instead has been a cause for regional instability. So Indonesia has opted not to respond to China's actions in the South China Sea and elsewhere by, for example, simply conducting freedom of navigation operations on its own, or by using every single opportunity to speak out against China or to point fingers. Indonesia has adopted another sets of measures in a way that, again, I think Australia understands, but for the most part, Australia expects a lot more.
Gatra, you and Ewan described the Australia-Indonesia Defence Cooperation Agreement, or the DCA, as evolutionary rather than transformative. What would it take for this agreement to become a true strategic game changer?
So historically, I think you've laid it out early on, John, in the podcast. Australia-Indonesia defense and security cooperation has really improved since the times of Timor. During the Cold War, there was strong security cooperation, particularly under President Suharto and later on Paul Keating. Timor sort of again ended a lot of that, but then it was the Bali bombings. It was this renewed common interest in clamping down against people smuggling as well as terrorism and a set of non-traditional security issues that has really helped revitalize the relationship. This led to the Lombok Treaty back in 2007, which, amongst other things, committed the two countries to collaborating more closely on combating non-traditional security issues. Now, since 2007, or since the early 2010s, really, there hasn't really been a major security issue that both sides have equally championed with the same degree of passion and enthusiasm, right? I think in many ways right now, Australia and Indonesia see the strategic environment very differently. Again, so in response to U.S.-China competition, they both see it differently. Indonesia shares Canberra's concern about some of the negative implications of China's rise. Indonesia shares Canberra's preference to have the United States actively involved in regional affairs, but then they've responded to U.S.-China competition in almost nearly opposite ways, right? Indonesia has sort of focused on the ASEAN Plus mechanisms, focused on multilateralism, on getting both sides, the U.S. and China, actively engaged in the ASEAN platform. Whereas, of course, Australia sort of doubled down on the security relationship with the U.S. Now, the Defense Cooperation Agreement, when it came out, I think was heralded by a lot of politicians in Canberra as being this amazing achievement. And I think it is in many ways, right? It is sort of a legal update or upgrade to the relationship. It provided some protections. But the response was very different in Jakarta. I think folks in Jakarta generally see it as more of an administrative upgrade. And again, it's difficult to see any serious update or strategic balance to the relationship when the two countries see the world very differently.
How do you think Australian policymakers should view ASEAN? You know, I mean, having having studied a little bit about Southeast Asia in the past, I must say our ability to respect the process of ASEAN is what is found wanting, shall we say? And I think that the same can be said about the United States as well. You know, the way that we go about things is far, far more culturally different from anything that happens in Southeast Asia. Where do you think we need to go in terms of trying to be able to accommodate these two very different approaches?
So I think Australia has actually done as much as it can within the ASEAN Plus mechanism. A core part to it is that Australia does not lead within this framework, right? As a middle power and one that is outside of ASEAN, Australia must provide that opportunity to lead to ASEAN. That was the central idea of the ASEAN Plus mechanisms. ASEAN countries, in collaboration with other countries in the region, would collaboratively forge, ways of cooperation. Now, the current Albanese government and even the previous governments have sort of in many ways, I think, said the right things when it comes to the ASEAN Plus mechanisms, that things like respect for ASEAN centrality, a willingness to collaborate within the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, and so on. Now, the challenge, particularly in the Australia-Indonesia relationship, is the involvement and the creation of minilaterals that are, again, possibly focused on threat actors. And I say possibly because it's never been that explicit that, for example, AUKUS or the Quad arrangements are focused on China. So there's a high degree of discomfort in Jakarta about these two arrangements, even though President Prabowo, for example, says he understands why AUKUS and Quad arrangements exist. At its core, generally within the defense and foreign policy elite, folks are concerned about two things. Firstly, can these arrangements disrupt ASEAN's initiatives within the ASEAN Plus mechanism? And secondly, can they really achieve what they do in that? Can they really achieve the goal of, for example, ensuring that China plays by the norms and rules set by the ASEAN Plus mechanisms, which includes things like the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which commits countries not to use force in order to resolve disputes. So the question is really there. Historically, Indonesia has never really had a serious concern about the U.S. alliance system. Back in the 90s, even Foreign Minister Ali Alatas mentioned, I think at one point, that the U.S.-Japan alliance was an anchor of regional stability. Now, that's a statement that has not been said again, I think, by any foreign minister. But the point is, there is deep appreciation for there is deep appreciation that for the normative frameworks that ASEAN has advocated, there has to be some serious military power to back it up. You need to have a bad cop as well as a good cop, right? But again, the problem is there's uncertainty as to whether these kinds of arrangements could really work out.
Okay, so Gatra, Indonesia is courted by China, Russia, and BRICS partners. How should Australia differentiate itself to ensure Jakarta sees value in prioritizing Canberra?
So I think generally Australia does have a positive image within the defense and foreign policy ecosystem in Jakarta. Yes, China and Russia and many other countries are courting Indonesia. But if we were to imagine sort of the nature of the relationships or in partnerships with these countries, Indonesia's relationship with the US, with Australia, is a lot deeper than its relationship with Russia. Yes, you are seeing a lot of new initiatives under President Prabowo and in the later years of President Jokowi. But if you were to imagine them as sort of different sets of bars, for example, one is reaching, say, 70%, and the other one is still 30%. Now, with China, of course, the economic relationship is very deep, but the security relationship is still not as deep, and the people-to-people ties are still also quite limited and constrained. Australia's selling point and strength has always been in the normative power of education and capacity building. I think there's deep appreciation for the many trainings and exercises between the two countries of Jakarta. A lot of Indonesian soldiers have had their training in Australia, either through the Australian Defence Force Academy, Defence College, even ANU, for example. There's a lot of interest in training in some of the bases in Northern Australia. So that was one of the major important outputs that came out of the Defence Cooperation Agreement. So again, it's going back to, firstly, the educational opportunities that Australia can provide, as well as the capacity building opportunities that Australia can provide. And China and Russia are still, far, far, far behind Australia in that regard.
How was President Prabowo Subianto's inauguration received in Canberra? I mean, do Australian policymakers see his presidency as a fresh opportunity for defence ties or a potential challenge given his nationalist instincts and past controversies?
So I think generally policymakers, and these are the folks who are based in defence and the foreign policy systems, Prabowo is a known name to them, so they really understand the many paradoxes of the individual, right, of his character. They appreciate the fact that Prabowo is a man who understands Australia well, who understands the West well. He is fluent in English, and some say that even when he gets angry, for example, his natural instinct is to yell in English rather than say in Indonesian. See, he grew up right in the UK and the US and so on. He had his training in the US. And as defense minister, he was very supportive of the defense relationship with Australia. The Defence Cooperation Agreement was signed when he was defense minister, and also outside of that, as evidently he has been very friendly towards. He has been very understanding towards Australia's policies. He has been willing to again recognize the importance of Quad and AUKUS. He has been willing to free the remaining members of the Bali Nine, so that was a major diplomatic coup for Australia. And again, when Prime Minister Albanese visited him in Jakarta just a few months ago, Prabowo went to his hotel. I mean, he wasn't just seen as a professional colleague. There were serious personal attempts to court each other, right? So I think generally the political elite, the foreign policy elite here is they understand that he could be a boon for Australian interests. Outside of that, though, there is also the recognition that Prabowo does have authoritarian tendencies. He has past human rights abuses. He has a notorious temper, and throughout his campaigns in the past, he has advocated for fairly hardline nationalist policies. The challenge, of course, is what happens when there's a flare-up in Indonesia that forces Australia to respond. You mentioned West Papua, for example, as an issue earlier on in your intro. If there were serious human rights abuses in West Papua that required Australia to respond, that would put the government in a very uncomfortable position, right? But for the most part, again, I think the policy leadership here understands that Prabowo is a man that can be worked with.
Turning on to other matters, cyber attacks, disinformation, and maritime insecurity are common concerns between Australia and Indonesia. How can cooperation in these areas be structured so it doesn't inadvertently undermine democratic norms in Indonesia?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, one of the key recommendations in our report is collaboration on combating hybrid threats, right? And one of the domains where there is mutual interest is in the information and cyber domains. Both countries, suffer a great deal of problems coming in from cyber scams, cyber criminal organizations, but also from state actors that are, say, interested in spying on critical infrastructure or also stealing intellectual property and so on. So there's actually a lot of shared interests and common threat concerns between the two countries. Now, the challenge in Indonesia, I think, is that the cyber domain is very much seen as equating the information domain, and that's separate, I think, generally in the West, because you can have, again, content that should be allowed to be shared. For example, things like general criticism against government that should be allowed and tolerated. And as a democratic country, Indonesia should be tolerating criticisms against government. But what happens when, say, the military or the police clamp down? Now, I think this is one of the reasons why collaboration hasn't been that deep in the information space. I think there has been attempts to sort of find areas of collaboration, say, in the disinformation, in combating disinformation. One fundamental element of that's important to highlight and to advocate is if there is collaboration in the information space, it shouldn't just include, say, the militaries or the cybersecurity agencies of the two countries. It must be a multi-stakeholder effort and that involves civil society, academia, and so on. Because there are a lot of, for example, fact checkers in Indonesia who would love to be able to engage with Australian fact checkers and civil society to just compare notes, to do some workshops here and there. So it must involve everyone, and it can't be restricted again to just folks in the military or the security space.
Gatra, you and Ewan recommend a Track 1.5 format be developed. For our audience, can you explain what a 1.5 track format is? And given sensitivities around sovereignty, what would this dialogue actually look like in practice?
Sure. So there are several tracks when it comes to engaging between, say, countries or organizations, right? Track 1 dialogues refer to engagements between government officials only. So this might be your usual ministerial to ministerial meetings, 2+2s, right? And then you have Track 2 dialogues, which just involve, say, civil society, academia, maybe industry. They don't really involve much government involved. They don't have any government officials necessarily participating in conversations. Track 1.5s are things in between. So they have government, and they have maybe civil society, industry, academia, think tank community, and so on. So the selling point of the Track 1.5 dialogue is that it offers an alternative to Track 1 dialogues, which are oftentimes very scripted, and Track 2 dialogues, which are oftentimes very don't have as much impact as Track 1 dialogues. So they provide opportunities for government officials as well as, again, non-government counterparts to hash ideas out, to debate, to discuss issues of burning importance. So they're not always effective. I mean, there are plenty of Track 1.5 dialogues out there, and they're not always done well. But I think part of the logic of making sure that sovereignty issues don't become a serious problem in discussions is to have these Track 1.5 dialogues, because again, oftentimes the conversations are not recorded. They're private. They're not necessarily confidential, but then they're under what's called Chatham House. So information cannot be attributed. And again, a lot of countries, there's a history in Southeast Asia, for example, where authoritarian countries try to communicate with each other without offending the other side using these Track 1.5s, because academics can yell at each other. Academics might be able to say things or represent the emotions of a country without being, say, constrained by talking points, right? So that's the value of a Track 1.5 dialogue. And again, being an open space that's not open to the public domain necessarily means that you can be honest, and sovereignty issues don't necessarily, can be sidelined for now.
Gatra, I have to ask you, I mean, we talk about multi-domain and, all these kind of things in terms of trying to get on top of hybridized threats. But, when we're looking at a joint hybrid threat task force, for instance, they're going to be expected to function across two different sorts of bureaucracies with very different protocols and different levels of capacity. How does that all work?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's duty. It's part of the jobs of the Track 1.5 dialogue to of folks in the Track 1.5 dialogue to figure out,
Right, right.
because as you say, I mean, on the two sides, the foreign and defense policy making systems operate very differently.
Yeah.
When you have a discussion on security, that naturally involves more actors. Like imagine here in Australia, you can't have a conversation on hybrid threats without necessarily involving Home Affairs. Even internally within Australia, there might be challenges and different cultures, right? Imagine between the two sides. So the purpose of this Track 1.5 dialogue is to try to figure out what is the best method of communication for discussing, common hybrid threats. It may be the case that you don't need to have a hybrid threat task force at all if existing platforms are sufficient. If, for example, we trust that the 2+2 meetings, so these are the meetings where the foreign and defense ministers of Indonesia meet with their Australian counterparts every year, if they're sufficient, for example. Or at the working level, if you think, I don't know, say, for example, the head of Home Affairs and the Indonesian equivalent will be sufficient. So that would be down to the Track 1. Individuals involved, the Track 1.5 dialogue to figure out.
Okay, so how should Australia address Indonesia's sensitivities about Canberra's very real US alignment and AUKUS commitments when conducting joint training or base access negotiations? And here I really got my focus on, the future is an undiscovered country. I mean, we can talk about governments getting on now, but, we're always one step away from a diplomatic spat of sorts. So how do you see a sustainable, good working relationship between Jakarta and Canberra at that level?
Yeah. So if we look back to 2021, I think when AUKUS was first announced, right, September, the AUKUS arrangement was announced, I think, a week or two after a 2+2 in Jakarta. So at the time, Maurice Payne had the opportunity to tell Retno Marsudi, her Indonesian counterpart, about AUKUS, but she didn't. And there are understandable reasons why, but that offended Indonesia.
Yeah.
More than just the existence of the AUKUS arrangement itself. It's this idea that, I mean, this is a big deal, right? You're getting nuclear submarines from another country. It's an arrangement that, again, from the Indonesian perspective, could also not only undermine regional stability, but realistically, if you were to send out nuclear submarines to East Asia, whether it be the South China Sea or Taiwan, it has to go through Indonesian waters. And the nuclear fallout could be devastating for Indonesia's water ecosystem and so on. So it was the lack of transparency, I think, that annoyed the Indonesian side. And I think being open about intentions is important. I think Australia and Indonesia have developed a fairly close working relationship. I mean, obviously not as close as that would say Japan or the US, in my view, or even arguably the Philippines from a defense standpoint. But having said that, I think these kinds of big arrangements would be best communicated to Jakarta, not necessarily to get Indonesia's input, but at least just let them know we're going to be doing that on this date, and this is the reason. You can respond in whatever you want, but at the very least, you'll know why we did this. So that open communication is important, and matters for Australia as well. I mean, if you go back earlier this year during the election season, there was news story that broke that the Russians were interested in some airbase site in Papua, right?
Yep.
I mean, this was a big deal. According to the Liberal Party, Peter Dutton at the time, this was a big deal. But the Labour government sort of shut that down, and there were existing communications done privately between officials that reassured the Australian side that none of that was going to happen. So again, I mean, communication is central, and it doesn't have to be open, but at the very least, the people who matter should know.
Okay, well, I mean, on that level, we're not living in a world of great cooperation anymore, right?
No,
We're living in a very different planet in many, many ways, and
definitely.
the idea of transactionalism seems to be catching on internationally. How might this pose a threat to what you've just said, basically?
So I think broadly. Australian and Indonesian elites understand quite well that there's higher value in collaboration rather than, say, competition, right? And the relationship itself is broader than just the economic and security dimensions. It's a very comprehensive relationship. What matters is that both sides, even if there's a nationalist instinct to sort of demand more, reassure the other side that this is not going to be a consistency. Now, it does become a problem when you have, say, populist leaders on either in Canberra or in Jakarta who suddenly feel like they can bully the other side. I think, again, from the Indonesian side, that populace currently is Prabowo, and Prabowo does have an appreciation for Australia, and I think a deep respect for the bilateral relationship. So I would not see it as emerging as a serious issue as of now. And I think from the Australian side, again, there's recognition that Indonesia remains a fairly large and important partner, and therefore they would not disrupt the relationship completely.
Okay, so Gatra, you and UN propose expanding naval cooperation to include the Philippines. Might Indonesia view this as provocative, and how could such concerns be mitigated?
Yeah, so this was one of our more provocative recommendations, I think, and it's
Yes.
important for think tanks to play that role in which we throw out some interesting ideas, right? So the trilateral cooperation. So for context, Indonesia is generally okay with trilaterals. So it has a trilateral cooperation with Malaysia and the Philippines over the Sulu Sea on non-traditional security issues. It also has it's also been willing to work together with other countries for security matters outside of the ASEAN framework. Now, Indonesia is only concerned if there's a clear threat actor, because Indonesia's approach, especially since the fall of Suharto, has been to focus on non-state actor threat agnostic, on threat agnostic initiatives, right? So collaborating with the Philippines in itself, with Australia, is not necessarily going to upset anyone in Jakarta, as long as the purpose is clear. I think there is a joint maritime security interest for the three countries. Three countries are maritime states, and they're also democracies, right? All of which are very concerned about security and international rules and norms at sea. So in principle, I think there would be no serious contestation to that, as long as again, there's no clear threat actor. Now, our proposal for trilateral cooperation is not necessarily a formalized form of trilateral maritime security cooperation. It could simply include, for example, including Philippine maritime actors into existing maritime security cooperation initiatives between Australia and Indonesia, or vice versa. So it's just an appreciation, I think, of that the three countries have common interests and shared challenges.
Okay, before we continue, a quick reminder, if you're enjoying The Focus, please hit subscribe wherever you listen, leave us a review, and share this episode with friends or colleagues who care about global affairs. It's the best way to support the show and help us bring you more of these in-depth conversations. You can also follow me and The Focus across LinkedIn, X, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, and Threads. Gosh, so many social media outlets, it's ridiculous. Now let's get back to our discussion. Gatra, East Timor, the 2013 spying scandal, and the Bali 9 tensions shook the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. How can the DCA and other government-to-government ties be made resilient enough to survive future political shocks?
I think the existing state of relations is actually evidence that the bilateral relationship is actually relatively resilient. East Timor was probably the worst crisis in Australia-Indonesia relations since Confrontasi in the 60s, right? Since East Timor. I mean, since the invasion of East Timor. Since then, the two other issues that you mentioned, whether it be the 2013 spying scandal or I think not long before that, that was also the cattle ban as well, live cattle ban. There were issues. Right. Yeah, there were issues that were, and the Bali 9. These were issues that were overcome. And yes, there were diplomatic moves that signaled displeasure, recalling ambassadors, for example, or closing down certain, pausing temporarily certain training, but it recovered. Again, I mean, I think you're going to have these structural challenges in the bilateral relationship, both from a domestic or international strategic angle. Again, so their domestic politics will always be an issue because just how different the two countries can be. But also, again, disagreements about the U.S. and China can be an issue. But the Australia-Indonesia security relationship is actually evidence where two countries can actually get along relatively well, despite all these challenges.
Hmm. Okay, so if we look at defense industrial cooperation, for instance, local content rules and corruption concerns within Indonesia prevent deeper defense industrial ties between the two countries. What proven cooperation models, such as military medicine or C-130 upgrades, could realistically be scaled up?
That's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't have a direct answer to that.
Mm,
At its current state, defense industry cooperation remains limited because of the issues you mentioned, right?
yeah.
Because I think the preference in Indonesia is that if you do give certain equipments, Indonesia will be allowed to. I mean, some of the products well, the equipment would involve Indonesian products. That's what local
Mm,
content requirements means, and there's
mm,
also a lot of corruption involved, which is also probably not something you want to really get involved in. So defense
mm,
industry cooperation sadly has been relatively slow. I mean, there have been interest in the Bushmasters, for example, but I'm not sure if that's going forward. Now,
mm,
cooperation on things like science and technology are also relatively constrained. I mean, yes, as you say, that was military cooperation in military medicine, um, uh, and uh, and that's something that's ongoing.
mm.
But broader cooperation on science and tech seems to be limited because it's a question of what is needed and who's willing to fund it. So I think whatever effort exists right now to encourage, say, defense or defense-related universities to collaborate, if you could see a prospering of that, that would be good. But at its current state, those elements, you're right, are very much lacking. And I'm not sure if either side has a clear idea of what the priority should be. Now, the DCA does mention science and tech cooperation as well as defense industry cooperation. The logic is
Mm.
not necessarily to indicate that we have plans on these issues, but it's to protect future collaboration where possible. And eventually, I'm sure there will be opportunities in the long run once the innovation space in Indonesia improves, corruption is reduces as well, and there's greater appetite in Australia, for example, to collaborate in defense industry and science and tech.
Okay, so I'm going to get you to gaze into your crystal ball, Gatra. What would convince you that the DCA had matured into a durable trust-based partnership rather than just a transactional framework?
Yeah, so I'm going to set aside the issue of strategic convergence, i.e., seeing the world similarly in the same way and then doing the exact same thing. I don't think there's any possibility that, for example, Indonesia will suddenly engage itself in the AUKUS or Quad arrangements, for example. And
Yeah.
I don't really see Australia abandoning its alliance with the United States either in support of, say, some secure relationship with Indonesia. So setting that aside, say in the next 10 years or so, I think heightened training, heightened training cooperation between the two countries, more access to education and capacity building, more access to training grounds. I think a greater openness in discussing security issues beyond just ones that are immediate challenges, like say people smuggling or transnational crime, but also things like cyber and beyond would be ideal. One where the two sides are also willing, I think, to uh, engage closer in innovation will be important. So again, this means investing more in things like defense industry collaboration, but also in science and technology, including things like military medicine. So I think that's the movement that the two states are going through right now. Realistically, of course, you don't need to see significant qualitative improvements to demonstrate that the defense relationship is working well. Collaboration on hybrid threats, again, I think would be sort of the next step. But again, and of course, broader engagement with like-minded partners like the Philippines, like India, would also be, or Malaysia, would be a decent next step. But I think 10 years from now, if the relationship was still existing as is, that's not necessarily a failure. Again, it's data. Business as usual is not really a bad thing.
In the introduction, I suggested that while Canberra stresses Indonesia's importance, at least from a government to government basis, Polls suggest that Australians know more about China and Japan. How profound is this ignorance about our nearest neighbour?
So I would argue that the same thing happens in Indonesia, where I think most Indonesians don't have a decent understanding of Australia.
Yeah,
There are very few, for example, Australian studies programs in Indonesia. Same way, though, I mean, you're right. The number of, I think, the degree of Indonesian literacy, and by that I don't just mean, say, being able to speak Indonesian. I mean, the general knowledge about Indonesia is not as high as it is about other countries. And if you look at the Lowy polls, I think there's still a lot of people who think Indonesia is a dictatorship, for example, or has high levels of Islamic radicalism,
yeah,
all of which
yeah.
are not entirely true. So I think I've always believed that investing in area studies, as well as both at the university as well as the school level, even,
Mm, mm.
is important. It should not be driven by market demands. It should be driven by genuine strategic goals, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you want to have an Asia literate Australia. And in my view, you want to have an Indonesia that is also not only Australia literate, but also literate about its wider region. Um,
Mm.
but that requires investments from governments because, again, it's not market driven. The number of Indonesian studies students have declined significantly, I think, going back since the 90s. Without genuine understanding and area studies knowledge, the risk is that you end up creating policy that is not fit for purpose,
Mm. Mm.
that you sort of set aside each other's interests, and then whatever understanding about each other gets implanted by stereotypes as well as by other sets of interests and other sets of interests. What happens, for example, if it's just folks who are interested in economics or national security and nothing else who are suddenly
Mm.
taking over Indonesia policy or vice versa? That's not entirely a good thing.
Okay, so we mentioned West Papua before, but I'd like to drill down a little bit further. So West Papua resonates with Australian civil society, but it's a highly sensitive topic for Jakarta. How much of an obstacle do you think it poses to the broader defence and security partnership? And will Indonesia, or can Indonesia, under current conditions, you know, give a hard pass to Australia's very different civil society expectations?
So I think generally, folks in the diplomatic community in Indonesia do understand that there are limitations to what the government can do in response to civil society demands. Although this understanding is not widely shared in government,
Yeah.
which is again why area studies is important. And I've been in a position where I have to insist that it's not like the Australian government can just clamp down on every single West Papuan activist because it recognizes that West Papua is part of Indonesia. For the most part, we have not seen any serious repercussions on the bilateral relationship. The last time there was crisis over West Papua was, I think, in the early 2000s when a boat of West Papuan refugees were accepted into Australia. In the 2010s, an activist in favor of West Papuan independence, also grabbed national headlines in Indonesia, and she was staying in Australia. Although that did not disrupt the relationship, I think again at the elite level, at the policymaking level, there is understanding of that. Firstly, Australia again can't clamp down society, and from the Australian side, there's an understanding that West Papua, again, is part of Indonesia and that Australia respects Indonesia's territorial integrity. This will be, again, an obstacle in the same way that domestic politics can be an obstacle in the bilateral relationship. But having said that, it has not disrupted the defense and security relationship as of yet. And I don't think it will
Mm.
necessarily just yet.
Well, fingers crossed. Anyway, look, another thing that is interesting to pursue here. I mean, Australia has long relied on Indonesian cooperation on drugs and terrorism and irregular migration. How effective has this been, and does it build trust or breed friction? I mean, we hear about the cooperation, but at what level does it sort of start fraying at the tactical sort of level? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm also not a huge expert in this particular area, but having said that, I do think the results has been relatively mixed. On the
Mm.
one hand, mutual interest in people smuggling and transnational crime and other kinds of issues like drugs have facilitated actually deep working level collaboration on both sides, and this includes again a lot of opportunities to learn from each other. I mean,
Mm.
Jakarta has a law enforcement center Indonesia has a law enforcement center in Central Java, in Semarang. And Australian experts and Australian law enforcement officials are oftentimes engaged, both as trainers as well as students. So I think it has allowed a lot of collaboration at the working level, possibly allowing them to, again, the two sides to really understand better each other's bureaucratic and political culture. That matters a great deal, so that you'll understand why things can't work or why things can work. Now, of course, it's mixed because of those political and bureaucratic problems, right? Indonesia was obviously unhappy about the Stop the Boats program of the previous coalition government, because that meant that Indonesia had to take care of a lot of the people being pushed back, even though Indonesia has not signed on to any refugee conventions by the United Nations. So I think politics can sort of disrupt good working level relationships, but then can disrupt the quality of the bilateral relationship in combating these issues. But working level relationships have grown and continue to develop, and there's deep police cooperation between the two countries.
Okay, so we were talking about stereotypes earlier. So for many Indonesians, their main encounter with Australians is through Bali tourism, often marred by headlines about bad behaviour. Do such perceptions meaningfully damage Australia's image? And can people-to-people relations move beyond the Bali nightclub strip?
I should hope so. I think there's actually been there have been so many initiatives, cultural, people-to-people initiatives, youth exchanges, between the two sides, and there's been serious effort from a lot of enthusiasts on both sides to make sure that folks don't just see Australians as as drunks in Bali, or vice versa. Australians don't see Indonesians as just like, I don't know, radical Muslims or something. But you're always going to have these challenges. I don't think, for the most part, they really damage the overall bilateral relationship. I think Bali does welcome Australian tourists. And this was highly felt, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the tourism industry was obviously very heavily affected, right? I think obviously it matters a great deal that there's serious effort to sort of communicate to the Australian public about what you should and should not do on Bali. Bali, sadly, has, well, it's good for the economy. They've got a lot of tourists coming in, not just from Australia, but also China, from India, from Russia, all of whom are very rowdy. So not just Australians this time. So sometimes,
Oh, I'm glad you said that.
so it's not just you guys. But having said that, I think something that the Indonesian government has to do is obviously prepare Bali and improve its infrastructure for the flow of tourists, because it's challenging, isn't it? Because you want to preserve a lot of the tradition, a lot of the older infrastructure, but at the same time, you do need modern infrastructure to accommodate the rapid growth of tourists coming into Bali.
Oh, that's true. That is very true. Okay, so final question, Gatra. Recent violent protests in Jakarta, including the tragic death of a young driver struck by an armoured police vehicle, again highlight questions about democratic fragility and police accountability, at least from an Australian perspective. How do such events affect Canberra's confidence in Jakarta as being a reliable partner? And how should Australia balance solidarity with democratic values against the risks of appearing to meddle in Indonesia's domestic affairs?
Oh, that's a very good question, and obviously one that's very contemporary and very, very now. The protests are still ongoing in Jakarta, and a lot more people have been killed. I think as of today, 4th of September, I think around 9 people have been killed, and over 1,200 students have been arrested. So a lot of Indonesians are very concerned about the state of affairs, especially since not only some of the police officers have been injured, for example, have been rewarded with promotions, but the president has instructed that the use of force, should things get really rowdy, should be allowed. Now, President Prabowo, not long amidst the protest, took the time to go to Beijing to watch the military parade, and in essence, that was an effort to sort of signal to the international community that he remains in power. That Indonesia is still okay, it's still politically stable, and for the most part, that's true. I think Australian policymakers understand that. Prabowo will still likely remain president for some time, at least the duration of his term, and these protests will just feature as parts of its presidency, really, right? I mean, just elements of its presidency. Now, what can Canberra do? Of course, respect Indonesia's sovereignty at this stage, but of course, I think allowing solidarity in the form of investing in things like area studies. I think there is an Indonesian studies program that's quite active across Australia. The sets of programs held by universities. A lot of them are really, require more expertise on political science. Require more investments for political science, for knowledge and economics, for defense, for many other sets of disciplines. And the reason I say that is because Australian universities have emerged as important platforms for students to voice out their concerns. As we're speaking right now, there are active protests by the Indonesian student community at the Australian National University in Canberra, in Melbourne, in Brisbane, Sydney, and so on, allowing space for these Indonesian students and the wider Indonesian diaspora community in Australia to voice their concerns and protests is important. And giving Indonesians that space to vent out their anger at their government is, I think, at this stage, the best thing that Australia can do.
Okay. Gatra, thank you very much for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you so much, John, for inviting me.
Australia and Indonesia don't always see eye to eye, and history shows that our relationship has never been simple. But if we ignore each other, we do so at our peril. Indonesia is not just our closest neighbour, it's a pivotal democracy at the heart of the Indo-Pacific. Building trust and understanding won't happen overnight, but the effort is worth it. Because in the end, the stability of our region may well depend on how Australia and Indonesia choose to walk this path together. From Canberra, that was the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Dr. Gatra Priyandita. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Gatra Priyandita. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Gatra and connect with him on social media. Now, on to questions for the audience. Do you think Australia takes its relationship with Indonesia seriously enough, or do we still treat it as an afterthought compared to China, Japan, and the US? Should sensitive issues like West Papua or bad tourist behaviour in Bali play a role in shaping foreign policy, or should governments focus purely on strategic and defence ties? If you were designing Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy, what role would you give Indonesia? As a central partner, a difficult neighbour, or something in between? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify. We would appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on thefocuspodadl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.